before I get going on the main lecture, if I could just make a housekeeping note. Some of you went out to the karaoke bar last night, and you crazy kids with your iPhones and whatever you have from Batman, you took a video. It's fine if you post it. I mean, I'm no stranger to self-promotion, don't get me wrong, but can you just at least send me an email? Because what happened last year is someone taped it and put it up, and I didn't know it was up there, and I was talking to my boss from the Institute for Energy Research, and he's talking about sending me to a conference, and they said, hey, but Murph, no karaoke. And so I start laughing, and I go, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And he says, dude, it's on YouTube. And so I didn't know it was up there. So anyway, so it's not a matter of, intellectual property or anything like that. It's just a matter of I need to come up with a backstory in case, It's like, oh, no, honey, I wasn't drinking. No. Okay. So I don't call my boss honey, by the way. That's... So I'm talking today about Austrian versus Neoclassical analytics, and this is actually a fairly new addition to this main lectures at the Mises University. That if you looked at earlier schedules from the previous years, like when it first started, they didn't have this lecture. I think the reason they added it was a lot of what we do in these lectures is try to get you to see what the Austrians do that's different from the mainstream, and so a lot of times we'll say, now of course the Neoclassicals do this, but we Austrians do this, and so we thought, especially for those of you who aren't going on to study graduate level economics, that maybe we should have a lecture devoted to, what do we mean when we use this term Neoclassical? So that's what the point of this lecture is, and what my goal here in this one is to just lay out almost neutrally, if you will, the differences, so that in theory, if there were a neoclassical economist that were here, like, bound and gagged perhaps, sitting here watching, that, he'd say, oh, okay, yeah, that is what we do. So obviously I'm going to be thinking the Austrian way is superior on these different issues I'm going to go over, but I hope that a neoclassical economist would agree that is a difference, and that's what they do and what the Austrians do. So before you can even start talking about the differences between the two, you should say, well, what do we mean by a neoclassical? And there, I'd like to give you a nice crisp definition, but I can't, because in different contexts it means different things. So generally speaking, here this week at Mises University, if we're talking about, now we Austrians do such and such, but the neoclassicals instead do this, we basically just mean the other, the mainstream of the economics profession. That if you went to a top 20 school somewhere and study graduate economics, like, this is the type of economics you would learn. That's basically what we mean. And so at that level of generality, a lot of times when we say this is what the neoclassicals do, we aren't really distinguishing between, there's post-Keynesians, new Keynesians, Chicago school economists, right? So those are all mainstream economists. So the word mainstream is probably, would be a better description if we mean it in terms of that broad of a category. So sometimes this week we'll say neoclassical and mean that interchangeably with the term mainstream, even though there are mainstream economists that wouldn't call themselves neoclassicals. In their mind, that's a term reserved for a smaller group of people that they hate too. All right, so on the other hand, so in that respect, neoclassical could be a very small group of currently practicing economists, the ones that are, and again, I'm going to go over this more carefully in a minute here, but just to give you the flavor of it, the ones who, assume agents are perfectly rational, that they know the future with certainty, or at least they know the probability distributions of everything with certainty, markets clear, the efficient markets hypothesis, all these things are, markets are all complete, that you can have contracts for just about anything or any commodity at any future time in any state of the universe. Really hyper-rational stuff, sort of like if you're going to take the approach to modeling formally with mathematical symbols seriously, and you're going to assume that these agents know how to do calculus, you might as well assume that they really know how to do calculus, right? That's the idea, that why go halfway with these assumptions? Let's see what this approach yields you. And it is a very elegant body of results, but it's completely divorced from the actual market economy. And most economists know that. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but it's a trade-off that, well, we can't go halfway with the math. If we're going to do it this way, let's really do it. So that's the idea. So a lot of economists recognize that that's wrong, and so you'll see now that there's plenty of mainstream economists at big universities, even Nobel Prize winners, who would themselves ridicule the strict neoclassical economists who assume people are always rational and stuff like that. So the behaviorists and psychologists and others that are coming into economics or drawing on insights from those fields into economics, they also wouldn't like the neoclassical. On the other hand, if you go to a website of the History of Economic Thought, so the New School in New York has a nice online compendium of History of Economic Thought articles, and they're coming from the left typically. But anyway, if you need to go somewhere and you want to get information that's a little bit more detailed than Wikipedia, if you go there, you can see some things. But they define neoclassical so broadly that even the Austrians would be neoclassicals. So in one sense, what neoclassical means is, new classical, meaning what happened after the classical insights. So it's after the classical economists, but yet it retains the wisdom of the classical economists. Right? So even though we don't like their value theory, and Joe Salerno went over this in his first lecture with you guys, talking about the flaws with the classical approach to price theory. And in fact, Karl Marx's economics actually was an offshoot of Adam Smith's economics. Right? A lot of people think that the two are opposite, totally opposed to each other, but they're actually not. I'm not saying Adam Smith was a Marxist. I'm saying Marx's positive description of how market prices work was based on a labor theory of value that he got from the British classical economists. Okay, Marx didn't invent that. So even though they are flawed in that respect, clearly, what does Adam Smith mean to the common man? He means the invisible hand that markets generally work. Capitalism is a good system, right? And so, and Keynes thought he was reacting against the classical economists. Now, in the general theory, Keynes, I think, puts up a caricature of what economists like Adam Smith and J.B. Say said about markets, but nonetheless, Keynes thought he was reacting against them, and it was true that the classical economists basically were free market guys, and they thought that tariffs and other interventions just screw things up. And they also thought that in a depression, it's not because people need to spend more. That's not the problem in a depression, or it's not a dearth of money that causes a business downturn. Right? So the classical economists knew those things. It's just their theoretical framework wasn't very useful, and that's why the marginalist subjectivist revolution came along. Okay, so in that sense, like an economist like Alfred Marshall, he would consider himself to be just continuing in the tradition of the classical economists. He thought he was just marrying the wisdom of the classicals with the insights of this new subjectivist marginal approach to price theory. All right, so that in that sense, Austrians are neoclassicals too. So anyway, but for the purpose of this lecture, obviously, I'm going to be meaning a narrower concept. And as I go through this, I think you'll know the neoclassical when you see him, even though it's hard to come up with a proper definition. Okay, so let me run through these. I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different categories so you can pace yourself as to ways in which the Austrians are different from the neoclassicals. Okay, so first we got a nice cautionary quote there saying, "Every school of thought is like a man who has talked to himself for 100 years and is delighted with his own mind, however stupid it may be." All right, so just keep that in mind. All right, so the first area of difference is the subject area of methodology. And the Austrians, of course, use the method of praxiology, and the neoclassicals use the method of positivism. I go over this every time, but let me very briefly say it while I have your attention. The words method and methodology are not the same word. They're different words. They mean different things. Usually in a paper, in the beginning, especially if you're in a formal class, like a graduate level economics program, if you're writing an academic paper and you want to explain, this is the technique I use to get my results, like I ran an econometrics regression, or I did this, or I did a linear programming example, whatever you're talking about, this is the method I used. A lot of people say this is the methodology, but that doesn't really work. Right? So methodology is if a paper is about methodology, that means in the paper the topic is, let's discuss the method we should use in economics. Right? So if you're writing a paper on praxiology, that's a methodological paper. But if you're just saying, I used a regression, come up with these results, you're talking about this is the method I used. Okay, so the Austrians use praxiology. You had a whole lecture on this already, but let me just put it in different words. So of course, the Austrians think that economic laws are necessarily true, so long as you did the deduction process correctly, that it's not that you could go out and see a counterexample to an economic law. And the analogies we always use are with geometry. That's the one that really clicks with people, that I can show you the Pythagorean theorem, I can prove it, and if you think it's wrong, the point is not for you to go out and start measuring triangles. The point is for you to look at the steps in my proof and say, wait a minute, you went from step 3 to step 4 and you said this, but I don't think that's justified. Right? Result 4, line 4 in your proof does not follow from line 3. That's the way you would attack me. You wouldn't go out and try to measure triangles, all right? Because if the proof is true, there don't exist triangles that violate the proof, right? Because that's how proofs work. So in the same way, if as Austrians, if we say other things equal, if the price of a good goes down and the quantity demanded goes up, you don't need to go out and start looking at statistics of prices and quantities, because first of all, the way we get out of that is the phrase other things equal, and the point is, once you know what those terms mean and you think through the logical implications, that result, the law of demand, has to be true. Now, it might not be useful. We can spin out all sorts of tautologies that might be totally irrelevant, but the point is, it's not that you are going to test them the way, in contrast, in the natural sciences, the physical sciences, you do have to go out and do experiments. All right, and specifically, the reason for that difference, if you want to get a little philosophical, is in the physical sciences, it's true you might have something like a proof, that you have a theory, like you say, this is how subatomic particles behave, and we've got Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and all those other things, and you can come up with calculations. And in a sense, the results follow from the assumptions you made, but the point is, those assumptions, we don't know if they're true or not, because we don't have any a priori knowledge of what behavior governed, or how the behavior of subatomic particles is governed, right? Whereas we do think we know about human action just by introspection and other techniques, right? That we don't have to go out and measure it the way we have to test things in the natural sciences. Okay, so that's the way Austrians approach economics, and again, the idea is, in order for you to just look out at the world and start making sense of it, to impose a framework on it, you need to have an antecedent theory. All right? A lot of times people will say, well, you economists are biased. You should just look at the world and see what happened. Let the facts speak for themselves. So, looking at the Great Depression, Murphy, you and a guy like Tom Woods, you go in already knowing that it's going to be the government's fault, and that's what you're going to see. Whereas, somebody else, and so you should really just look with an open mind. In fact, somebody recently criticized reviewed Tom Woods' book Meltdown, I think, and used that exact same criticism, that Woods went in there with, to do a hatchet job, and he didn't let the facts speak for themselves. But you can't let the facts speak for themselves, because there's just an infinity of facts, right? That looking back at the 1930s, I might say, oh, well, let's look at carbon dioxide emissions and see if that caused the Great Depression, right? I mean, because we know it causes global warming, so maybe it causes depressions too, right? So the point is, you need to know what facts to even focus on to come up with your theoretical explanation of what happened or what the cause was. And so it's very naive to say you have to let the facts and then come up with your theory. Now, obviously, in practice, there's a give and take there that I'm not going to get into now, go on a tangent here, but it's true if you had very speculative theories about something that were based on empirical beliefs, and then it turned out those empirical beliefs were wrong, you might have to revise your opinion, but the point is that explanation in your mind would not be a pure praxiological theorem, right? It would be more, to say what caused the Great Depression. We know the business cycle theory, the theory is correct. The issue would just be, well, maybe that wasn't the main driver of what was going on in the 20s and 30s. So it is possible that Rothbard and I are wrong when we say the Fed caused the 29 stock market crash. That's theoretically possible, but the point would be that wouldn't blow up the Austrian business cycle theory. All that would mean is, we mistakenly thought those conditions were what caused what we know happened, and actually it was something else, right? So it's a subtle interplay there when you're an economist armed with a priori theories, and then you're looking out at the historical facts to try to sift through and come up with an understanding of what happened in this time period. All right, so what do the Neoclassicals do? And here it's ironic because there's a difference between what they do and what they say they're doing. All right, if you will, there's a difference between their method and their methodology. that the neoclassicals will tell you, and this was enshrined in Milton Friedman's famous essay. I think he had a book called Essays on Positivist Economics or something like that. And Roderick Long later in the week will talk about it. But what they say they're doing is that they think they're being very scientific, and they think that they're, we know that physics works. That's the queen of the sciences. And so everyone who wants to call himself a scientist wants to be like the physicists. Not so much now, I think, as like in the 40s and 50s, like the physicists were, they built the atom bomb, and it's like, wow, we can't kill millions of people. These guys are cool, all right? So, well, actually the Keynesians could, but, all right. So anyway, they want to ape the methods of the physicists, and so when they write up methodological pieces, they think that's what they're doing, and they say, the way Friedman in particular defends himself against the charge that you guys assume people are perfectly rational, that they're supercomputers and all these other things, or that they know their own preferences, they know what's best for them. You economists assume all these things when you spin your fairy tales about the wonders of the free market. And so the way he dealt with that, Friedman said, yes, you're right, we do make unrealistic assumptions. We assume things that aren't true. And so in that respect, the implications of our model are wrong. But we think that the simplifications we're making are innocent enough or small enough so that the results being generated, the predictions getting spit out of this model that we have, are the best we have to go with, right? And that it's incumbent upon you, the critic, to come up with a better model that gives better predictions than my admittedly flawed model. That's what Friedman's explanation was. And he used an analogy of a guy playing pool, like a pool hustler, a person who's really an expert, can make all kinds of crazy trick shots. And he says, now this guy might have grown up in the pool halls his whole life, and he's never gone to school and received a formal education. And yet, if we're looking at the state of the pool table with the position of all the balls, and then he's about to hit the cue ball, how do we predict what's going to happen? He said, if we are armed with Newtonian physics, we would assume that. We would assume that the professional pool player knows those two, and that he's going to apply just the right force so that the mass times the acceleration, blah, 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 and does the right thing, all right? And so, and Friedman says, so somebody could point out, well, this guy can't possibly know Newton's laws, because he never, formally studied. He's just been a hustler his whole life. And the point is, well, it's a reasonable enough assumption. It's as if he understands Newton's laws, because we really can't get in and model all the neurochemical things going on in his nervous system. We don't know. That's an impossible task. At least right now it's impossible. We can take a shortcut and assume that he knows Newton's laws and just use that. And yeah, once in a while we'll be off, but the guy's an expert, and so it most of the time will be close enough. And then he'll say, again, if you want to try to go the route of modeling his nervous system, go ahead, but there's no way you're going to be able to, even if you knew at the molecular level how his cells interact with each other, it's just such a complicated system to predict his actual movements that's crazy. You're going to get nowhere with that approach. Go with our approach, and that's a good shortcut. And so, but the criterion for, is it a harmless simplification or is it giving us a really misleading answer, is always predictability. That if it gives you better predictions than another model, then it's a better model. That's what it means to be a better model. All right, so that's what Friedman says they're doing, but in practice, a lot of times they don't do that. And Walter Block always gives his favorite example of when, I think he was doing graduate work, and I don't remember what the exact thing was, and he'll probably go over it in his lectures with you this week. But when he comes up with something that, he came up with an econometric study, a result that contradicted the implications about rent control or something like that. I don't remember what it was. And he showed it to his advisor, and the advisor just said, you got the wrong answer, do it again. Right? So it wasn't that the advisor said, oh my gosh, maybe we're wrong to think that rent control causes shortages or whatever the issue was. But no, he knew that Walter Block had run the regression incorrectly, right? Or more recently, these guys came out with a study showing that minimum wage laws, when you hike the minimum wage, it doesn't retard employment in the fast food industry. And most economists didn't even need to look at the study. They just said, that can't be right, that's crazy. Right? So you can see that in practice, even the mainstream neoclassicals, a lot of especially the free market ones, they do believe in economic law, and they really, it would take a lot to make them overturn their convictions on something. Okay, so I should move along now. All right, the next one I want to talk about, I don't really know a cute title for this category, so I'm just going to call it explanation. There's going to be 3 of these in total. So I'm just meaning when they try to explain economic phenomena, these are differences between the 2 schools. So the Austrians believe in cause and effect, or they stress the idea of cause and effect, and to some of you that might sound funny, like, you mean the other guys don't? And no, they don't. Thanks for asking. Now, I don't know, because with a lot of these mainstream guys, it's hard to know what do you actually think about the economy and what do you have to say, at your job. And I don't mean that they're lying, but I just mean they're constrained, and I don't think a lot of them actually deep down really believe in their models. It's more of, again, Friedman's idea that, well, this is what we have to use, this is the professional standard, this has been vetted through the peer review process, and this is what we all use, and yeah, there's all kinds of shortcomings. But what I mean is, I think some of them know that the models are crazy and that you would never trust the answer getting spit out of them. It's just the way we've set up our institutions. This is the model we're all using right now. Like for one example, a guy, and this could be apocryphal for all I know, but the story goes that there's a mainstream professor at a big university, I'm making this up, but let's say it's Harvard, and he gets an offer from MIT, and he's deciding whether to stay or go. The money's different, but there's different hours, and the commute's different, and so on. And he's trying to weigh the decisions, and he asks his buddy, what do you think I should do? And the guy says, well, why don't you just write out your utility function and take the derivative and set it to 0? And the guy said, come on, this is serious, right? So again, I wasn't in the room with the guys, so I don't know if that really did happen, but that's the story. But that really does capture the idea here that I don't think these people actually believe it. Just like when people say, oh man, that Barney Frank, I can't believe how stupid he is. I'll say, no, he's got a lot more money and power than you do. He's not stupid, he's just lying, right? So, the same way, I think a lot of these mainstream guys, I'm not saying they're liars, I'm just saying I don't think they actually put as much faith in these models, and so don't get too carried away when you get mad at them. Just think, you have to understand the constraints they're under. They have to get tenure and so on. Okay, so the Austrians, what do I mean? I'll be really quick on the Austrian stuff, and I'll spend more time on the mainstream guys, or the neoclassicals, excuse me. The Austrian cause and effect, what I mean is something simple like, they say, okay, what is the cause of the price of steak? That question is meaningful to an Austrian. The Austrians say, oh, it's ultimately due to subjective marginal utility. That the reason the price of steak is what it is because people have their valuations, and I think, was it Jeff Herbner, or maybe it was in Salerno's lecture where they went over the marginal pricing and how that works in a state of barter, and you can come up with what the equilibrium price would have to be, given everyone's valuations, right? So the Austrian, when they say, what is it that's causing market prices, the Austrian has an answer. Whereas the mainstream economist, that question actually doesn't make much sense. And to give you an example, well, let me tell you what their general view is. They think it's simultaneous determination, meaning that what you do is you figure out all the different conditions operating at any given time in the economy. So the consumer preference rankings or utility functions, if that's the way the model's set up, supplies of various commodities, technological recipes that the entrepreneurs know, and then you just start writing out conditions that have to be true in equilibrium, and then you come up with the equilibrium outcome, and that's what it is. And so it doesn't make sense to say what caused this because it's everything that caused it. So the analogy that they might use is to say in a bowl of marble, if you have a bowl of marbles, if you point to one of them and say what's determining the position of that marble, that's kind of a nonsense question. All the marbles together, like once it's sitting there, are all mutually influencing each other. And the reason any one marble is where it is because of all the other marbles, and you couldn't really look at a flow of cause and effect. To give a different example, I gave a talk at the Austrian colloquium at NYU on interest theory, talking about the pure time preference theory of interest. And I was, saying, is it caused by subjective utility or by productivity? And I was going over that, and a neoclassical guy who was trained at Chicago, who's, very open-minded guy, and he came and sat in on the lecture because he wanted to see what do you Austrian guys do. And then afterward, I was talking to him, and he said, I really didn't understand what you guys were talking about. What do you mean, what is interest caused by? It's just, the equilibrium outcome. So in his mind, it was, you have the production function, you have the capital stock, you take the derivative with respect to K, and that's what the interest rate is, right? So, what do you mean? What's causing it? It's everything, all the different what they would call exogenous elements of the model determine the endogenous variables. That's the way they would talk. All right, so that's, again, a simple sort of philosophical difference there, that the Austrians, their explanation involves the notion of cause and effect, whereas for the mainstream economist or the neoclassical economist, it doesn't really. So they can spit something out of the model, but it's not like there's one thing that operates and then causes something else. Okay, the third one is the area of rationality. So the Austrian, for him, the term rationality, to say that economic agents are rational, all he means by that is that they're purposive, that they have purposes, so that human action is necessarily rational. And Mises somewhere says something like, the very term rational action is pleonastic. And they say, well, what does pleonastic mean, Ludwig? And you look it up, and it means redundant. Right? So he's saying, you're not adding anything by saying rational action, that what Mises means by the term action is necessarily rational. It just means there's a means-end framework involved. So somebody doing a dance, you say, what are you doing? Are you excited? Are you happy? You say, no, my crops are thirsty. I need it to rain, so that's why I'm dancing out here. That's not irrational. The common man might say, oh, that's crazy. That's irrational. You should learn about meteorology. But from a Misesian perspective, that's entirely rational. That to be rational doesn't mean you have to be right. It just means, what you're doing, there's a means-end framework, as opposed to pure reflexes or just bodily movements. So if somebody fires a gun and I go like that, it's borderline. It's not clear that I did that because I wanted to avoid a bullet. It's not that I actually went through and thought that through. It could just be a reflex, or even better, if someone comes up and cuts my arm and blood starts coming out, it's not that, oh, I'm choosing to do that because I had felt uneasy just holding too much blood in my system, right? It's, I'm not, so it's movements of my physical body, but it's clearly not an action in the Misesian sense, right? So that's, that's an insight a lot of people don't understand, because there's a lot of people that don't even see the distinction between bodily movements and human action, right? They don't realize that the same physical thing could be different depending on the subjective intention. To give an example that Hayek gave, he said that, to know if something is a weapon, that's not a purely physical characteristic of it. That's not inherent in the object. You have to know what are the subjective intentions of the person using it. So, I could take this pen and go up to one of you and say, that's a dumb question, and hit you in the eye, and that's certainly being used as a weapon. But if you just saw from afar me doing that, you wouldn't know, because maybe it's just a freak accident, and I had an itch and I was about to scratch my head, and then I tripped, and oh, geez, right, So you say, okay, I'm not asking him any questions, right? So you see, the fact that the pen is a weapon has nothing. Studying the physical characteristics of the pen, that's not going to get you anywhere. You need to know what my subjective intentions are, right? So, so that's what the Austrians mean by purposive action. And so if action is, so to say that agents are rational does not have any implication on how smart they are or how well they're forecasting the future. That has nothing to do with it. They're rational if they're doing something to try to achieve a subjective end or desire. The neoclassicals, their notion of rationality, so they'll say, yep, agents are rational. In our model, we're going to assume the agents are rational, and they mean something entirely different from what the Austrians mean. What they mean is that they are, they mean a couple things. So one thing is they're very good mathematicians. They can solve the model. So in a modern model, especially after what's called the rational expectations revolution or innovation ushered in by Robert Lucas primarily, the way a modern neoclassical model will work is the agents in the model have to understand what the model is like. So you can't put agents in the model and have them think the Fed is following one rule, but really the Fed is secretly doing something else. You can't have that. So there's complete transparency in the neoclassical models. No need for a Fed audit because they all know what's going on. It doesn't mean, though, that they have perfect foresight. So this is a subtle thing that a lot of people get tripped up on. It's true that mainstream neoclassical models did used to assume the person at time 1 knows what the price of cotton is going to be at time 100. And so he forms his plans, and that's how you get a certain outcome. They don't assume that anymore. Now what they assume is the agent at time 1 knows the probability distribution of the price of cotton throughout time, possibly dependent on, information he learns along the way. All right, so it's a refinement. So they're trying to deal with the objection that Austrians and others were raising to this perfect foresight assumption they made. So they relaxed it, but it's still true that the agent knows the structure of the model. Okay, so the way I summarize it, I say there's no regrets. So it's true that agents can make mistakes. You can get a neoclassical model that has rational expectations built into it, and agents can, they can buy stock thinking it's going to go up in price when really it goes down. That's fine. But the issue is when the stock price does go down, the people who bought it, they're going to say, yeah, in a sense, I made a mistake, but I did the right thing with the information I had at the time. So to give you an analogy, for those of you who are familiar with blackjack, let's say you're at the table and you get an 11 and the dealer has a 6 showing and it's a freshly, shuffled deck. And the correct thing to do is for you to double down. Now, it's possible you double down, you get a 2, the dealer flips a 4 and then pulls a 10 and you lose your money. And you can say, yeah, if I had known that was what the sequence of cards on the top of the deck was, I wouldn't have doubled down. But the point is, you're not really going to be mad at yourself because you did the right thing with the information you had at the time of your decision, right? So that's the only sense in which agents can make mistakes in formal neoclassical models with rational expectations. And so in particular, it's more difficult to see the role of entrepreneurship and what function profits serve if in your model everybody knows the probability distributions of consumer taste changes and technology changes and all that stuff, right? So you see these assumptions do lead to certain policy conclusions, but in this lecture I'm not going to talk so much about policy. I just want you to see the way they look at economic analysis and why that sort of filters into their conclusions. Okay, so the next one is utility theory. So here the Austrians have a definitely ordinal approach to utility theory. The neoclassicals, it's subtle. So I've described it as ordinal in theory but cardinal in practice. Okay, so again, a brief refresher for the Austrians, just in case you lost this in the beginning. So ordinal, what does it mean when we talk about ordinal versus cardinal numbers? The ordinal numbers are things like first, second, and third, whereas the cardinal numbers are 1.278 and 3/16 and things like that. Okay, so that's the difference. You can remember that ordinal, it means an ordering. Okay. So for the Austrians, utility theory, it doesn't make sense to say something like an apple has 3 times as much utility as an orange. That doesn't make any sense. It's not merely that it's false or that how could you ever know something like that. It's that the statement is nonsense. It's like saying, Joe is 3.7 times a better friend than Mary is, right? Now, Joe might be a better friend than Mary, and if someone says to me, who's your best friend, I can answer that, and that seems perfectly sensible. But when someone says, how many Joes would it take for you to be willing to give up one Mary? You see that's a little bit odd, and especially if you said, how many friendship units, would 7 Joes have, right? Okay, so anyway, that's where the Austrians are coming from, and then of course there are implications of all this stuff. But let me just move on. So the mainstream, or the neoclassicals in particular, so be careful. Those of you going on to grad school, when you start arguing with a mainstream economist or neoclassical economist, you don't want to go in guns blazing and saying, you guys believe in cardinal utility and that's stupid. Because if they're sharp, they're going to say, no, we don't. Go look at any micro book and you'll see that when we derive utility functions, that's just a shortcut we're using. We really are only assuming that there are ordinal preference relations. So for the purpose of this talk right now, I'm not going to get too technical, but what they do, and so that's true. And if you look at Brian Kaplan has an essay that received a lot of attention called Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist. You could just Google that, Brian with a Y, B-R-Y-A-N, Kaplan, Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist. And he was, like, when he was in high school, I think he was a huge fan of Mises and Rothbard, and then he sort of was disillusioned with that, and now doesn't consider himself an Austrian. He's still a fellow traveler, but one of his main objections was that he thought the Austrians were just being goofy by accusing the Neoclassicals of believing in cardinal utility, because they use what certainly looks like cardinal utility functions, right? So what do you mean you guys don't believe in cardinal utility? Well, the explanation they'll give, again, is that it doesn't, if they say, U equals 2 times O plus the square root of A, where O and A stand for the amount of oranges and apples, and so you can plug in how many does the consumer buy and come up with how many utils does he have, the Neoclassical is going to say, we don't really mean anything by that except to say if you drew the indifference curves, that we could figure out where you maximize this function U, that's where you're going to be in the highest indifference curve, right? And so like I said, it'd be a little bit technical for me to get into now, so I don't want to, but that's what they mean. And in particular, they're smoking gun as to show they don't really mean anything by utils per se, is they'll say you can do what's called a linear transformation of a utility function, and it's not going to screw up anything. That you give me a utility function that refers to this consumer, you can then take all the numbers it generates and multiply them by 2 and add 3, and that's not going to change anything, right? That when the consumer maximizes and tries to buy different bundles of oranges and apples, depending on their price and his budget constraint, you're always going to get the same optimum bundle popping out, even if you transform the utility function the way I said. All right, so we don't really mean anything by assigning numbers of utils to particular bundles. It's just a shortcut so that we can use calculus rather than doing, graphing it. All right, so that's what they say, and like I said, that is true, that a good micro textbook at the graduate level will go over that and show you, and even stress, don't think that the utils mean anything. It's not that people really have utils. What they have are ordinal rankings of various bundles of goods. But in practice, I think most neoclassicals actually do believe in utils, and I've even seen recently, there's an argument about progressive taxation, taxing richer people at a higher rate, and other people are arguing about it, and Will Wilkinson had a thing, and then I think Matt Iglesias came back with something, and Alex Tabarrok at GMU commented, and they all were arguing with each other, and they were all just taking it for granted that there were utils that were interpersonally comparable, and the matter was just, is that the justification for why you have progressive income taxation? And that's what they are. And now, I think Tabarrok at GMU he might not believe in utils, but my point is he didn't even get into that because he was arguing on other issues. So the point was it was assumed that people have utils, and you can talk about, if I take $1 from a rich man and give it to a poor man, have I increased total social utility, right? So that kind of talk, that's far beyond what's going on in the micro textbooks when they talk about, just revising or coming up with a shortcut to predict consumer behavior. All right, so that kind of stuff, coming up with a social welfare function where you add up everybody's utils, that does not follow directly from the little trick they use to come up with cardinal utility functions, right? So it's, like I said, if someone's sharp, they'll think that they can answer you, but I think in practice they actually do believe in Benthamite utility, that you can add up and come up with social happiness or social utility. Okay, so remember to pace yourself. This is the 5th one. I think we got 2 more after this. So again, another difference between them in the way they explain things. So I'm calling this explanation part 2. The Austrians explain economic outcomes by reference to the choices people make, whereas the Neoclassicals rely on indifference. So in terms of the Austrians' choice, be very quick on this. When you say, how is it, why is it there's a market price is what it is, and the Austrians will say, well, because people, they have preference rankings, and when, why is this thing $5? Because it was worth it for the last person to, they preferred the object to the $5 bill, so they made that exchange. But then at that point, we were in the plain state of rest, and given everyone's preferences at that point, there were no reverse valuations, and so no one wanted to, no one strictly preferred the other thing to what he had, and vice versa. So that's why there were no more exchanges at that point, right? So you're always explaining each individual exchange and then the cessation of trading by reference to differences in valuations and people strictly preferring one thing and so they choose to swap it. The mainstream or neoclassical economists, in contrast, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, the way they explain prices is through indifference. So they'll draw indifference curves, and then the way they'll explain economic behavior is to show at what point would no action take place. And then they say, oh, that's got to be the resting point. All right, so it's they both sort of agree with what the other person is saying. All right, so that the neoclassical economists, they understand that at all the what's called infra-marginal trades, there was a strict difference in valuation going on. But their point is people keep trading until, breaking up into infinitesimal units, the person's just indifferent. And so the reason they bought 3.87 units of apples at this price per pound is because that was the exact point at which, using calculus, the person's indifferent between acquiring one more tiny unit of apple or giving up one more tiny amount of money. All right? And so that's, again, it's sort of a philosophical difference. Part of what's driving that is the mainstream neoclassical assumptions of perfect divisibility of goods and so on, that if you ask a mainstream neoclassical economist, do you actually think in the real world people buy, I guess applesauce, to have apples divided up into so many fine units? And they say, well, no, we know that there's lumpiness, that in the real world people might have just strict valuations, not ever actually be indifferent, but this is a fair assumption. And again, the explanation for a lot is it allows us to use calculus. It makes the analysis more tractable, is the word they would use. Okay, so again, be careful. I know a lot of Austrians say the neoclassicals explain things by indifference, but that makes no sense. If you're going to trade something, you can't be indifferent. And that is true, but like I said, technically what they're doing, they're not explaining all 12 units that are being traded by indifference. What they're saying is they would be indifferent at the 12th unit, and that's why they trade up to that amount. So they would realize if you challenged them, they must not be indifferent on units 1 through 11.999. But it's true that they don't really think like that. All right? Let me see here. I just need to skip ahead for a second. Okay, yeah, I want to do it on this one. I had an anecdote, but I'll save the anecdote for this one right here. Okay, so another difference in their way they explain things is market process versus equilibrium states. So the Austrians, and particularly the Austrians who are centered around George Mason University, they like to stress this a lot in particular. But Mises has a line somewhere in Human Action to the effect that the market is a process. So he's saying it's not just a place. It's not like, oh, there's the market over there. He's saying the market is this process, that it's people interacting, and it's not just a snapshot in time. It's the whole. You need to understand the equilibrating forces and so on. That to really understand how does the market operate, you can't just take a snapshot and look at the equilibrium prices. You need to know if it started out in a state of disequilibrium, how does the market converge, assuming nothing else changed, on an actual final state of rest, and then in an evenly rotating economy if everything stayed the same. Right? So that's a huge difference between the way the Austrians and the neoclassicals look at it, and this has implications primarily in antitrust theory, that understanding the market process the way the Austrians do, or looking at Hayek's essays on the use of knowledge in society and realizing that something can happen across the world, a copper mine can collapse, and what happens? That pushes up the price of copper, so then industrial users around the world economize on copper. They start substituting and using other metals. If they're given their process, they have a limited range of substitutability, and so the market price sort of communicates information about, and so the people don't need to get a fax from the owner of the coal or the copper mine saying, whoa, we have less copper than we thought yesterday, you better scale back your operations. You don't need to do that. The market price sort of captures that information. All right? So all those types of insights are what the Austrians have in mind when they talk about the market being a process, and you lose almost all of that in the mainstream approach the neoclassical approach, where they just look at equilibrium states. So in their mind, a copper mine collapses, they're not going to worry about how the prices go around and change people's behavior in that interim period. They're just going to say, okay, what's the new situation? What does the new equilibrium price of copper have to be? How much would people buy this new price? And they go and resolve the model that way. So, like I said, it's just looking at those two distinctions there from those approaches, you might say, well, that doesn't seem like such a big deal. But really, in practice, if you want to understand why it is that people who feel one way about antitrust come up with what to the Austrian is just crazy implications, and Tom DiLorenzo, I think later in the week, is going to talk about that. A lot of it is, I think, explained by this focus on equilibrium states. Let me give you an example. When I was in grad school, there was a test, and the question was something like, okay, picture a guy on a deserted island, so there's just this guy, there's no one to trade with, and he's got a tree that's yielding coconuts, and he knows the function relating time to how many coconuts. So he knows at time 1, this many coconuts comes out, time 2, this many, and so on. So he knows that function, and then what does the interest rate have to be in this world? That's the question. And so I was like, what the heck does that even mean? It's a guy on the island by himself. What would the interest rate even be? Who's he going to trade with? So then I thought, maybe it has to do with time preference. And so if you're in grad school, the beta, that's the discount on future utils. So I said, it's 1 over beta. And that's wrong. And it turned out what they were looking for was you had to say, suppose there were an intertemporal coconut market, right? Because the only good in this island was coconut. So the interest rate, the real interest rate, they meant if you trade 1 coconut today for a coconut next period, how many are you going to get? And again, this is a guy by himself, but that's what they mean when they solve it. They're trying to simplify things by saying, does it have 1 guy, right? We'll make it easy and get rid of all these other things. And this is true, by the way. I'm not making this example up. So the answer they were looking for is they said, okay, we know the guy can't trade coconuts away. He can't take a present coconut and offer it away to get more in the future, or go the other way, he can't borrow against his future coconut. So maybe if suppose the way the function works, it's like on time 1 there's 1 coconut, and there's 2 coconuts, and 3 and 4 and 5. So every period more physical coconuts are shooting out. He might want to borrow against that future income stream. So he might want to maybe just like smooth it out, maybe just consume 2 coconuts a day forever, and he pays for that because he borrows up front, and then later on when he's got more than 2 shooting out, he's got to pay the interest on his coconut debt, if you will, right? All right, you people are laughing, but this is serious stuff. So you can increase your utility if you can trade intertemporally with coconuts. All right, but so you see, so that's what they meant when they said, what's the interest rate in this world? They meant, what's the real intertemporal exchange rate of present for future coconuts? And okay, that's what it means. And so, but then further, you say, well, how do I solve it? Because it's just a guy. And you say, well, what it had to be is, using his utility function, knowing how he felt about consuming more coconuts today versus the future, what would the interest rate have to be to make him indifferent between consuming what shoots out of the tree every period versus trying to go into the time market and trade coconuts, right? Because we know the equilibrium outcome has to be that every period coconut shoots out, and that's what he decides to consume. But if we're going to lay on top of that a market where he has the possibility of trading intertemporally, the market price has to be such as to render him, unwilling to go use that market, to avail himself of that option. Okay, so that's what was all packed into that question, and that's the way you solved it. Okay, so you had to, again, the reason I'm saying that illustrates the indifference in the equilibrium states is they were saying, that what does the equilibrium price have to be so that he's indifferent and he's willing to go along and consume the coconuts that shoot out, because we know that's what the answer has to be. Okay, so that's, in fairness to them, it's not as totally crazy as it sounds. They weren't doing that because they thought it was useful to predict consumer behavior on a desert island. It was more the Robinson Crusoe approach that let's teach the principle on this real simple thing so that in a more general model, with machines and so on, that we don't lose sight of how you found out what the real interest rate is. But that's, I think, a good illustration. An Austrian, of course, would never reason like that, okay? All right, and then the last difference is their approach to capital structure. Now, I'm, of course, picking the things that to me are different. If a different faculty member were up here, he would focus on probably different categories, all right? But for me, the difference in capital structure is crucial, and that's really why it's going to sound patronizing, but truly, when I see guys on CNBC arguing about the recession and how do we deal with it, I mean, they don't even understand the Austrian point about the capital structure and how it can become unbalanced the way Roger Garrison showed you yesterday with his PowerPoints, right? That they don't even, it's not that they get that and then they think, oh, but maybe other things are more important. It's that they're not even acknowledging that possibility of that aspect of the problem, and they don't realize that their recommendations to, oh, we got to stimulate consumption spending, and the Fed needs to keep interest rates down to make sure we stimulate spending. I mean, they don't see that that's the exact wrong thing to do if part of what the problem is this imbalance in the capital structure. All right, so the specific concrete difference is the Austrians, they believe in the Mengerian order, or orders, excuse me, meaning they arrange goods. So you have first order consumer goods, and then you have second order goods, which are the goods that are used to produce first order goods, and then third order goods, and so forth. So you have higher and higher stages of production or orders of goods. On the Hayekian triangle, if from your point of view, here's the triangle, it starts low and gets big. Here in consumption is the first order, and then as you go higher and higher, back to wholesale and manufacture and mining and so on, that's you're getting into higher and higher stages of production. And so the idea is, what determines the height of a particular stage? It's how remote is that activity from the final consumer good that's going to shoot out of the pipeline at the end of the process. And so the Austrians are fairly unique. I don't think any other school thinks of it that way. I mean, the only time you'll see it is in a macro book, a mainstream macro book at the intro level, where they talk about when they're doing GDP calculations or GNP calculations, and they show how you only want to add the value added at each stage. They'll say here's the wheat farmer, and then there's the flour and the miller and the baker and so on, and they'll add the value added at each stage. That's really the only time where you'll get a sense of the fact that goods go through a sequence of operations, and the goods in process pass through different hands, different firms touch up things and then pass it on to the next person, and then there's a huge chain before raw natural resources get transformed into finished consumer goods. That most mainstream models don't deal with that aspect of things. So when you're trying to understand the business cycle, if the Austrians are right, then obviously that's the whole story, is understanding that process, and that it's not just a matter of we've got natural resources and we just put them into a production function and the next period outshoots the finished consumption good, right? So that's how the mainstream neoclassicals do it. They have typically in their models, especially a macro model, it'll be composed of one good, and they'll just talk about the capital stock, which they usually represent by a K. All right, so you cannot have the Austrian notion of a heterogeneous capital structure where, and to give you an idea, in the Austrian view, it's not enough to just say, well, what's the capital stock right now? Because if we had all tractors and nothing else, we would die. Most of us would die pretty soon, right? Or if we had all mainframe computers, we would all die. Or if we all hammers. If we had a bunch of hammers and no nails, well, that's pointless, right? So you can see it's not just a matter of do we need more or less capital. It's that you need particular capital goods that complement each other in certain ways, and there's an interlocking structure to it all. And that the people who are doing the mining then pass those mined materials over to the next stage, and then they process them, refine them, and pass them over the next stage. And so by the time you're at the point of the guy running a warehouse, and the clerk at Best Buy says, whoa, we're out of TVs, let's call the warehouse and get some more. I mean, they can't just on a dime do that. There needs to have been processes in motion for years in order for the person at the warehouse to be able to get more TVs to the people when the consumers take the last one off the shelf. Okay, so that time dimension and the interlocking capital structure you get in the Austrian school, you don't get that at all in the mainstream approach. Okay, so those were all the categories I had. Let me just, in closing, say that later in the week, once we start with the breakout sessions, I do have a topic where I'm going to be talking about Austrian solutions to neoclassical puzzles, something like that. So then that one, it'll be more of a showing the absurdity, whereas like in this one, I was trying to just show you the broad differences. So I'll stop at that point. Thanks.